With the foundation now in place, the next step is to see how research design emerges in practice. The Determining Your Research Design Part 1 video established that the design does not stand alone. It grows out of the research problem and the literature gap, taking its shape from the type of knowledge the field still needs. That framework now makes it possible to look at concrete situations in which the logic becomes unmistakable. When the phenomenon, the tension, the consequence, and the gap are examined together, certain studies reveal a clear need for experiential depth. Others require measurable patterns, and still others demand both. In this video, we will examine specific examples where the structure of this reasoning becomes visible. Each case shows how a well-constructed problem and a clearly identified gap naturally lead to a qualitative design, a quantitative design, a mixed methods design, or a qualitative approach grounded in conceptual clarification when the constructs themselves have not yet been defined. These examples will illustrate the alignment that transforms a design from a choice to a conclusion, making it clear how methodological decisions follow directly from the problem and gap's logic. In many studies, the need for a qualitative design becomes clear when the field has documented the broad contours of a phenomenon, but has not yet examined how the individuals living inside that phenomenon understand it. Our first example, newly certified teachers entering accelerated licensure pathways, offers a clear illustration of this. These teachers often report feeling overwhelmed by the competing demands of planning, instruction, and assessment, yet the existing literature may only catalog retention rates or describe general patterns of burnout. What remains unknown is how teachers interpret their early responsibilities, how they understand the expectations placed upon them, and how they navigate the emotional and cognitive dimensions of that transition. The research problem reveals a tension embedded in experience, and the literature gap shows that the missing knowledge is interpretive rather than measurable. Because the phenomenon cannot be understood without hearing how teachers themselves make sense of their early roles, the study requires a qualitative design capable of capturing the meanings that shape teachers' early careers. A second qualitative case arises when a phenomenon cannot be meaningfully quantified because the constructs inside it have not yet been defined. Students in accelerated online courses often disengage early, but the field may not yet understand what aspects of pacing, cognitive load, or instructional scaffolding contribute to that disengagement. Prior studies may report withdrawal rates, but fail to describe how students experience the rapid pace, which parts of the course feel overwhelming, or how they interpret the scaffolds meant to support them. Without understanding these dimensions, it is impossible to determine what should be measured or how to operationalize the constructs. The literature gap in this instance signals not only a lack of interpretation, but also a lack of conceptual clarity. Before variables can be identified and quantified, the field must first know what pacing pressure, or cognitive overload, means to learners. The research problem and gap indicate that the study must develop conceptual understanding before any measurement can occur. Therefore, a qualitative design is essential. A quantitative design becomes necessary in studies where the constructs are already defined. The research problem concerns outcomes or relationships among variables, and the literature gap involves untested empirical questions. An example arises when districts expand mathematics tutoring programs across multiple middle schools. Despite similar models being implemented, achievement gains differ markedly across sites, raising concerns about equity and effectiveness. Existing literature may describe tutoring programs broadly, but it may not test whether dosage, frequency, group size, or instructional format predict differences in student performance. The research problem identifies an unresolved pattern of inconsistent outcomes, and the literature gap shows that the relationship among key variables has not been measured. Because the missing knowledge involves numerical patterns and empirical verification, the field requires a method capable of modeling predictors and testing associations. A quantitative design becomes the logical choice because it generates the measurable evidence needed to understand how specific program features influence achievement. A mixed methods design becomes necessary when the problem contains both a measurable pattern and an unresolved conceptual mechanism. This arises in studies of students using AI-assisted writing tools. Schools may observe that students submit more assignments when using these tools, suggesting a measurable increase in productivity. Yet teachers may simultaneously notice wide variation in writing quality, student confidence, and revision behaviors. The existing research may document the pattern of increased output, but offer little explanation for why some students benefit more than others, or how students experience the tool as they write. The research problem thus contains two layers: the empirical trend of increased submission rates and the conceptual tension surrounding variation in outcomes. The literature gap shows that neither the productivity pattern nor the internal experience of writing with AI can fully explain the phenomenon on their own. What is missing is both the pattern and the mechanism. Because the problem requires measurement and interpretation, a mixed methods explanatory design becomes necessary to produce the dual knowledge required to understand how AI tools influence student writing. It is helpful to see how misalignment occurs when a research design is chosen too early, or for the wrong reasons. One common error appears when a question rooted in lived experience is forced into a quantitative frame. A study focused on understanding why first-year teachers feel overwhelmed might be introduced through surveys and statistical comparisons, as if the phenomenon could be reduced to numerical scales before anyone understands what overwhelm consists of, or how teachers interpret their daily responsibilities. The design in this case is not merely imperfect. It prevents the study from answering the very question it raises. When the logic is revised and the research problem is recognized as a matter of meaning and interpretation, the missing knowledge becomes clear. The field does not need measurement. It needs insight into how teachers make sense of their early roles. Once the research problem and the gap are correctly understood, the study naturally falls into a qualitative design capable of revealing the depth of that experience. The method no longer feels like a choice. It becomes the only coherent way to respond to the tension the study has named. A second misalignment appears when a study that requires empirical modeling is framed qualitatively. Consider an investigation in which a district wants to know whether tutoring time predicts improvements in mathematics achievement. The constructs in this case are already defined, and the question centers on whether one variable influences another. If such a study attempts to answer this question through interviews or observations alone, it cannot produce the evidence required to determine whether time truly matters. A qualitative design cannot test the strength or direction of the relationship, and it cannot reveal whether the observed differences reflect meaningful patterns or chance variation. When the research problem is articulated clearly, and the literature gap is understood as a lack of empirical testing, the missing knowledge takes on a numerical form. The necessary design becomes quantitative because the tension can only be addressed by modeling the association between dosage and outcomes. Once again, the design aligns itself with the problem once the logic is complete. A third misalignment arises when mixed methods are selected simply because they seem comprehensive or innovative. In these instances, the study may begin with the assumption that combining methods will strengthen the work without first determining whether the research problem and gap actually require two forms of knowledge. A mixed methods design without a dual tension is not a powerful tool. It is an unnecessary complication. When the problem is examined more closely, and it becomes clear that the phenomenon is either fully experiential or fully empirical, the dual requirement dissolves. The missing knowledge is singular, not layered, and the design becomes singular as well. Only when the research problem contains both a measurable pattern and an unresolved mechanism, only when the gap demands both empirical verification and interpretive explanation, does mixed methods become necessary. When that dual requirement is present, mixed methods is not chosen for its breadth. It is chosen because neither qualitative nor quantitative alone can answer the question. These wrong-to-right comparisons clarify the central principle that guides every methodological decision. A design cannot be imposed on a study. It must emerge from the structure of the problem and the shape of the gap. When the tension is experiential, the design becomes qualitative. When the tension is empirical, the design becomes quantitative. When the tension contains both a pattern and a mechanism, the design becomes mixed methods. The method aligns itself with the type of knowledge the field does not yet have, and the study's coherence grows directly from that alignment. As the logic of the research design becomes clear, a certain linguistic pattern begins to emerge, one that reflects the structure of the problem itself. When the reasoning is sound, the language naturally follows a progression that mirrors the analytic sequence used to determine the design. The statement often begins by locating the tension inside a real phenomenon, drawing attention to what is unfolding in practice. It then moves directly to the unresolved dimension highlighted by the literature, indicating that prior work has not yet explained or measured an essential aspect. As these pieces accumulate, the sentence turns toward what the field still needs to know. The structure that emerges is: the research problem reveals a tension within a documented phenomenon, and the literature gap shows that the field has not yet clarified the dimension of that tension that matters most. Taken together, these elements indicate the type of knowledge the study must produce, making a particular design the method through which that knowledge can be generated. When the missing knowledge is experiential, the phrasing shifts in a way that underscores meaning and interpretation. A researcher might describe the logic by writing that the problem exposes a discrepancy between intention and lived experience, while the literature shows that prior studies have not yet examined how participants make sense of that discrepancy. In such a case, the argument naturally moves toward the need for interpretive knowledge, concluding that a qualitative design is required because it provides access to the perspectives, meanings, and internal processes that define the phenomenon. The design appears not as a methodological announcement, but as the final step in a chain of reasoning. When the missing knowledge is empirical, the language adopts the cadence of measurement. A study might be framed by noting that the problem identifies outcomes that vary across groups or conditions, while the literature shows that no studies have yet tested whether certain variables predict those variations. The reasoning then shifts toward evidence rather than interpretation, indicating that the field needs quantifiable insight into the strength, direction, or significance of the relationships at stake. The design becomes clear when the sentence arrives at its conclusion. The study requires a quantitative approach because the unresolved tension concerns patterns and associations that can only be examined through statistical modeling. When the missing knowledge is dual, the language reflects that complexity. A justification might begin by acknowledging a measurable trend that has already been documented, then showing that the literature has not yet explained the mechanisms that produce variation within that trend. The phrasing then moves toward the dual nature of the unresolved question, indicating that the study must both identify the pattern empirically and interpret the experiences that shape it. The final turn makes the alignment explicit, allowing the design to emerge from the reasoning itself. A mixed methods approach is necessary because it provides the combination of empirical and interpretive knowledge that the problem requires. In each case, the design justification becomes a narrative of logic rather than a methodological declaration. The phrasing reflects a study built from the inside out. The phenomenon that leads to the tension that leads to the gap that reveals the missing knowledge, and the missing knowledge that determines the design. Each sentence in the justification echoes that structure, reinforcing the principle that a research design is not selected in advance. It is the final expression of the knowledge the study must produce, and the language of the justification gives voice to that discovery. Here is a model qualitative paragraph. Teacher overwhelm has increased in alternative certification pathways, particularly in high-need schools where new educators assume full instructional responsibilities almost immediately. Prior research documents rising attrition and reports general categories of challenge. Yet the literature does not explain how teachers themselves understand the transition into their roles, or which aspects of the experience feel most misaligned with their preparation. The research problem reveals a tension rooted in the lived experience of beginning teachers, and the literature gap shows that the missing knowledge is interpretive rather than numerical. Without understanding how these teachers make sense of their responsibilities and navigate the emotional and cognitive demands of their early practice, the field cannot determine why certain conditions produce stress, or how support structures might be improved. Together, the research problem and the gap indicate that the study requires meaning-based, experiential knowledge. For that reason, A qualitative phenomenological design is necessary because it allows participants' interpretations, perceptions, and sense-making processes to surface as the central source of insight. Here is a model quantitative paragraph. Districts continue to expand mathematics tutoring programs to reduce persistent achievement gaps, yet even schools implementing the same model report widely varying outcomes. Although prior studies describe tutoring structures and teacher perceptions, the literature has not tested whether specific features of tutoring, such as dosage, frequency, or instructional format, predict differences in student performance. The research problem identifies an unresolved pattern of inconsistent achievement gains, and the literature gap reveals a missing body of knowledge on measurable relationships among established variables. Understanding whether particular components of tutoring contribute to improved outcomes requires empirical evidence rather than interpretive insight. Together, the problem and the gap indicate that the field needs numerical knowledge about the strength and direction of relevant relationships. A quantitative correlational design is necessary because it can model the relationships among tutoring features and achievement, providing the statistical evidence required to evaluate the intervention's effectiveness. Here is a model mixed methods paragraph. AI-supported writing tools have led to increased assignment submission rates in secondary English classrooms, yet improvements in writing quality and student confidence vary widely across learners. Existing research acknowledges the productivity gains associated with these tools, but does not explain why some students benefit while others struggle, or how students experience the tool as they write. The research problem thus contains two layers: a measurable pattern of increased output and a conceptual tension surrounding uneven growth in writing skill and self-efficacy. The literature gap confirms that the field lacks both a tested empirical explanation for differences in outcomes and an interpretive account of the mechanisms that produce those differences. Together, the problem and the gap reveal that the study requires two distinct forms of knowledge: statistical modeling to identify outcome patterns and qualitative insight to illuminate the experiences and processes that shape them. A mixed methods explanatory design is necessary because neither measurement nor interpretation alone can resolve the tension at the center of the study. Only their integration can provide a comprehensive understanding of how AI tools influence student writing. They show that a research design does not exist in isolation or as a matter of personal preference. It rises directly from the kind of knowledge the study must produce, and the shape of the puzzle the research problem has revealed. When the phenomenon, the tension, the consequence, and the literature gap are examined as a single structure, the design becomes the final expression of that structure. Qualitative inquiry emerges when the field needs to understand how participants experience the phenomenon, or when the constructs themselves have not yet been defined. Quantitative inquiry emerges when the field requires measurable evidence about patterns, relationships, or outcomes. Mixed methods inquiry becomes necessary only when the problem contains both a pattern that must be modeled and a mechanism that must be interpreted. This alignment is what gives a study its coherence. When the design reflects the type of knowledge the problem demands, the research questions fit, the methods follow naturally, and the eventual analysis speaks directly to the unresolved issue in the field. Everything that comes later, the data collection, the analytic procedures, the findings, and even the implications, rests on this moment of alignment. Once the design is justified through the logic of the problem and the gap, the study is no longer a loose set of ideas. It becomes a focused inquiry with a clear purpose and a defensible methodological path. With the research problem established, the literature gap clarified, and the design now aligned to the type of knowledge the study must produce, the groundwork for a coherent research plan is complete. The next step is to choose a more specific quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method approach to turn that alignment into a purpose statement that captures, in a single sentence, what the study will do, how it will do it, and the kind of contribution it is positioned to make.